Hi, welcome to Remember This. I'm your host, Denise Bolin. If you recall, it was the 1970s and there was a serial killer walking the streets of New York City for more than a year, between 1976 and 1977, terrorizing everyone, especially women. That is until David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, who killed 6 people and wounded 7 others, was captured, putting an end to it and leaving many asking why he did it. My next guest I'm so pleased to have with me is Dr. Mike Caparelli, who has a PhD in behavioral science and has met with David Berkowitz over 34 times, sessions that totaled 100 hours, and has written this book about the sessions, about his time with David Berkowitz, called Monster Mirror. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Denise, for having me. It's a great privilege to be on the show.
It's my honor. It's my honor. I saw you on the 700 Club, and I just knew I had to have you on. I was there at the time. I was like 12, 13 years old over this 1 year period. And I remember the fear that everyone had, especially young women, because it seemed like David was targeting women. And so if I have brown hair, if I have long hair, they were putting their hair up. Women were, changing the hair color. I mean, it was a very, very scary time. And I also remember when he was caught. And I think what stands out the most for most people is that he had that grin on his face, So you spent all this time with him, so you know the man, not the monster. So if you could just first start off with who you are, your background.
So I pastored a church in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm from. Actually, my stepfather was from the Bronx, not far from where David grew up. And so a lot of New York City influence. My family had come over early 1900s through Lower Manhattan, and then migrated to Rhode Island, and grew up in Providence. Providence, maybe about 2.5 hours from New York, an hour from Boston. Italian American, 17 years old. I'm locked up in juvenile jail, and I had just gotten a lot of trouble as an adolescent. And while I was locked up, 17 years old, I had a real experience with God that changed my entire life. Ended up pastoring a church for about 16 years, an inner city church, a lot of people in addiction, recovery, those struggling with mental health issues. So somewhere along the road of pastoring, I decided to pursue a PhD in behavioral science because I wanted a better understanding of some of the issues I was dealing with and how to effectively counsel these people. I already had a bachelor's in theology, a master's degree, so went forward with the PhD, which took about 7 years between coursework and research. And then in my 16th year of pastoring, I suffered a couple of heart attacks.
Oh, wow.
And
you're a young man.
Yeah, I'm inching towards 50. But I had my first minor heart attack at 41. And then I had my widowmaker main artery at 43.
Wow.
And almost killed me. And decided that I was done pastoring. The PhD was complete, so I had a couple of colleges interested in hiring me as a professor. I now teach at 3 different schools, teach psychology courses, abnormal psych, criminal psych, all the subjects that were under the PhD, and also began traveling in a variety of venues, churches, rehabs, prisons, schools, discussing mental health from a Christian Judeo worldview. My PhD is not a theological degree. It's not from a Christian college, but I blend when I lecture the sciences, what the science teaches us about the human makeup, and what the scriptures say, and had a lot of opportunities. I spoke the last year in 18 states, last couple of years, 3 countries. Next year, my calendar is probably full almost the entire year, just speaking on different subjects. Now, back in 2021, I mailed David Berkowitz, inmate number 78A, 1976 at Shawgunk Correctional Facility in Wallkill, New York. I mailed him a copy of my book, Dr. Jesus, a book about mental health from a biblical perspective. David reads the book. In about 2 weeks, he responds with a letter saying, I'd love for you to come visit. You're the kind of guy I've been looking for, somebody that understands the psyche, but it has a Christian background. I need someone like you to tell my story. So I met with David, uh, corresponded with him first for a few months, but my first actual visit in person was April 1st, 2021. COVID was still, I'm sorry, 22. COVID was still a reality in the prison. I had to wear a mask. David wore a mask. Kind of funny during that first visit because I'm looking for every reason to like lower the mask, and every time the guard walks away, I'm lowering the mask, and I just got this rascal still in me. And here's David, and he's obedient, compliant, and it's kind of amusing that you got this,
Right.
killer obeying the rules, and you got the pastor on the other hand, former pastor, clergyman, who's breaking the rules. So
Right.
a little amusing how
Funny.
the line between good and evil is erasable. It's not so fixed. It changes pretty quick. The sides. So I meet with David and we discuss his background. I tell him I'd be very interested in conducting a case study. As a PhD, I'm a researcher in human behavior. I'm not a clinical psychologist. That's often confused. A PsyD is different than a PhD. A PsyD, PSYD, is more often your degree for those that are clinicians. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a scientist. The difference is I don't counsel people clinically. I did as a pastor, but I do research on human behavior through case studies, social experiments, interviews. It's more about the study and the collection of data regarding human behavior than it is counseling people with issues. So I already conducted an extensive case study for 2 years on the impact of faith on people with addictions in recovery, and published that in academic journals. That was a 150-page dissertation. So doing studies on human behavior, that's my niche, in combination with writing books and lecturing. So I tell David I want to do a case study on what was behind the Son of Sam, but not only what was behind the Son of Sam, I also want to shed some light on the last 35 years of you being incarcerated since 1988, when you say you had this experience with God that transformed your life. I want to also shed some light on that. So David agreed to meet, and we met for 34 sessions, 100 hours. We're actually up to about 42 sessions now, but now it's just friendly visits. I just visited him last Saturday.
Nice.
And we met for the 34 sessions. I collected 9 themes. When you do this kind of research, you collect your data through interviews and copious note taking, but then at some point you back up and you look at the data. I mean, if you looked at my office walls, I had like pages and pages of notes everywhere because I'm a visual guy. I like to see the kind of big picture of things. And you do what's called thematic analysis, which means you're looking for the themes, the subjects that keep surfacing. And 9 themes kept surfacing, 9 mental health factors behind his 13 shootings, behind his 1 stabbing, 1,400 fires that he lit in the Bronx. And those themes included isolation, shame, abandonment trauma, head trauma, some issues during prenatal development when he was in his mother's womb, cognitive distortions, resentment. And I basically detail these themes in the book and how they interplay with violence. There's a lot of studies that are done on each of these subjects, and how, for instance, isolation, how that fuels aggression. Because David was, in many respects, isolated, not isolated like a loner in the woods, but because he grew up in New York City,
Right.
most populated city in
like
America.
Ted Kaczynski, who was like,
Contrasted with a Ted Kaczynski who's
Right.
a hermit. That's not David's story. David plays on baseball teams. Growing up in the Soundview section of the Bronx, he was part of the Appalachian Mountain Club. A bus would come into the city, pick up a group of teenagers, drive them to the Appalachian Mountains. Coincidentally, the mountains are right behind the prison that he's in today. And
Wow.
when he goes for walks in the yard of Shogunk, I'm saying it wrong, by the way. I can never pronounce the name of it right.
I know. I was like, I
Shawagunk.
don't even know how Shawag. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like Shawagunk, but I say
Shawagunk or
Shogunk.
I was like, do I mention it? Because I can't pronounce it. So I'm glad you said that.
But he goes for walks in the yard, and he can see
That's something.
where he climbed mountains in the gunks as a kid. So he's part of all these groups in the military for 3 years. He developed some pretty close friendships. He actually corresponded via letter for a little while with some of his fellow comrades. So he's not, when we think isolate, we think the loner hiding in the corner, but there's also the loner hiding in the crowd. And David wasn't hiding in the corner, he was hiding in the crowd. And it kind of illustrates this idea that isolation, loneliness, you can be with people. That doesn't mean you bond with people. David didn't know how to bond with people. He kept a lot of secrets inside of him, kind of hid behind a persona. So we talk about that kind of isolation that I believe the average reader, I mean, if you go on Amazon, you buy a copy of the book, you read the book, Monster Mirror, you're going to find out that David Berkowitz may shockingly be more relatable than you'd ever imagine. And so this isolation, there's a lot of studies that show what it does to aggression levels.
Yeah.
When people are isolated, they get more aggressive and they get less empathetic. Empathy levels go down. Empathy is indicative by a chemical known as oxytocin. It's called the bonding chemical. You can kind of measure that and see it in an fMRI. And aggression is adrenaline, cortisol. So as people isolate, the cortisol, adrenaline goes up, their oxytocin goes down. You know, it's kind of funny. You probably heard this said at the party a million times growing up. You go to a party, a guy is there, he's arguing with everybody. And then somebody says at the party, you don't get out much. Like, oh, I'm sorry for Joe. He doesn't get out much. It's like we intuitively know that when people disconnect too long,
they don't know how to.
They're not right.
Yeah.
And that isolation certainly played a role. David became more and more isolated as time went on. The last 6 months, before his arrest, as the killings were happening, I mean, David was not returning phone calls. Father was calling him, his half-sister who lived in Queens, his nieces, 2 nieces, young nieces that he loved, Wendy and Lynn, reaching out to him. He's not responding. So he's becoming more and more cocooned in his own mind and very distorted. Now, am I saying this is an excuse for the killings? Absolutely not.
No.
And David's not saying that. But we do need some explanation for the sake of being preventative with our own kids, signs to look for and how to intercede. And that's another aspect of this book that I'm hoping becomes a tool for others.
Yeah. What strikes me is he had mental illness, right? That's established. But he admitted to the crimes. Like, he didn't. Everyone's like, well, why didn't he plead insanity? Why didn't his lawyer get him to plead insanity? Did they try that and it was tossed out because he admitted to the crimes? How did that happen? How did that work out?
He was pretty adamant about pleading guilty. He didn't want to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. David, David, believe it or not, as much as maybe this flies in the face of some conceptions about him, he did experience a certain level of remorse. I mean, don't get me wrong. He played some games in the beginning for a while, and he definitely had some habits of lying and deceit. And we actually tackle that in the book. He actually makes a shocking confession in the latter half of the book. I don't want to say what that is. I'll let the reader read that and discover for themselves. But, he did feel like, look, I did it, and it's time to face the piper. And I'm not going out as this, crazy lunatic who didn't know what he was doing. There was a level of awareness on what I was doing and a culpability. Although he does believe that he was under some kind of demonic trance, which I discuss in the book. I don't just discuss the psychology, but I also discuss demonic activity. Now, you might not believe in that as a viewer, but I think we can all say that there is some kind of paranormal, if you want to call it, force or energy that can overtake someone, not to the point where they're not responsible. I mean, I kind of liken it to alcohol, right? I mean, somebody gets drunk, they act a fool. Are they responsible for what they do? Absolutely. They put the drink in their body, and often the drink reveals what's suppressed on the inside already. So it's the same kind of thing with demonic activity. David opened some doors along the way. He's responsible. There's no getting off the hook. There's no the devil made me do it. But I think we can all say there are points and times in our lives where we do things and we say, when we apologize after we do something that's out of character, punch a hole in a wall, kick the cat, whatever it is, we'll say, I don't know what got into me. I'm sorry. Or I don't know what possessed me. That's an interesting choice of words, possess.
Right.
Or I got carried away. What exactly carried you away?
Right.
So it's almost like there's this understanding, even though we might not call it Satan, that there is some paranormal wind or energy that assists us in doing wrong to a point where we get carried away, where we scratch our head and go, I can't believe I said that. I can't believe I did that. That's not me to do that or say that. And that's not an uncommon theme among serial killers. Ted Bundy sat with FBI for 150 hours. And when he described evil, when he was committing his very sadistic crimes, he called it an entity, something outside of his body. He said it was like being in the corner of the room watching himself from the outside. BTK called it the X factor. So there's this sort of language in a lot of the interviews with some serial offenders that insinuates a force that's beyond one's own character defects. Now, that's not to say that one's character defects aren't at play there too. I think it's a tango. Mm-hmm. David Berkowitz was resentful. He was angry. He was isolated and full of rage. A lot of it related to shame. And I get into that in the book and where that shame came from. But there's a sort of synergy or interplay or a tango between the paranormal and the psychological.
Right. Right. Well, I definitely believe in the spiritual realm, the devil, God, good, evil. We're seeing it now, in Israel, how, the evil, oh my God, like dragging people from their homes and you know what's going on. So I do believe if you open the door to the devil, yeah, you can end up being possessed and controlled. Mm-hmm. And I remember, I guess, Son of Sam, did it come from because the neighbor's name was Sam and he was saying that the dog was telling him to kill? Is that where Son of Sam came from?
Yeah, it's an interesting etymology, that name, because it really has, according to David's perspective, a dual meaning. Sam represented Samhain, which David says was a false god, a god of the underworld that he worshipped, a druid god that required sacrifice in the form of human. Mm-hmm. So Sam was short for Samhain, but then interestingly enough, the neighbor that the dog of that neighbor, Harvey, the neighbor was a man named Sam, Sam's dog named Harvey. The dog kept David awake at all hours. According to David, he started to believe the dog was actually a conduit for Satan. He started to see Sam, the owner of the dog, as a vessel of Satan. And in David's mind, it was sort of a confirmation that this guy's name is Sam, and I'm worshiping Samhain. So kind of the two of them kind of came together in this cocktail, this infusion of this must be Satan. And he became, from that point on, when he signed the letters that he left at crime scenes to taunt the police, the media, at least one of the letters, he identified himself as the moniker, the Son of Sam.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up about the letters. So he writes these letters. It's almost like he wanted to get caught. I mean, did he want to get caught because he wanted to stop in some way? Like, was there a battle within?
Yeah, he actually said, Mike, you get this idea of a serial killer, gloating in his crimes and full of glee, just he said it wasn't like this. I was tormented. There wasn't a moment of relief, no doubt. I actually talk about how violence can become addictive in the book. I mean, studies show that dopamine can be released in the brain at the pulling of a trigger. It brings this sensation, and there's a relief to pent up stress and frustration. So there's a moment of relief, but overall, throughout that time period, I was tormented. So there was this subconscious wish that may have actually been an impetus for him parking in front of a fire hydrant. David's a very careful, meticulous guy.
Right, the parking
I've,
ticket.
I've always been a little bit taken back by that. I mean, I watched David. I've known him. I've sat with David longer than anybody historically. Dr. David Abrahamson, the criminologist in 1983 or 82, conducted a 50-hour case study. I did double that. So I know David well, and he's very careful. He's a very meticulous guy. So it kind of made me scratch my head that he would park in front of a fire hydrant while committing murder. I just don't see that happening according to his personality. But if you take into account the subconscious desire to get caught, as you said, wanting this to be put to an end, which also we kind of see it when he's caught. The arresting officer said that David was sitting in the car in the driver's seat. The officer pointed the gun at him, and he, told him he was under arrest. He said, "Who do I have?" And David responded, "The son of Sam." But David turned and looked at him and smiled. It was sort of I said, "David, what's behind that?" A smile of relief.
Is that what it was?
There's a
Because we all saw the grin, when they were,
Yeah, the grin he says was, he said, believe it or not, people look at the grin as being cocky, and maybe on the surface it was cocky, but underneath it was a lot of shame. Now, often cockiness is a cover up for shame. If people are feeling ashamed, humiliated, one of the ways that people cope with that is by covering it up with arrogance or conceit or cockiness. So, really, I think at the surface level, it was cocky, but at the root level, was a lot of shame. And shame had really been a big part of his story. In fact, when he was a kid, he was a chubby kid. His uncle would body shame him often. If you go actually read some of the letters he left at the crime scenes, one of the letters he signed it, the chubby behemoth. Interesting choice of words, chubby, because that was one of the descriptions, given to him as a kid.
Wow.
And it really messed with his psyche. His teacher would take his desk and place it in the center of the class with one or two other rascals and say to the classroom full of kids, 50 kids or whatever, "This is where the bad boys sit." And David said, "Mike, going to school, I would try whatever I could to get out of it. I mean, I would take the thermometer, put it up against the radiator, heat it up. So I give it to my mother. It seems like I have a fever. I didn't want to go to school because I didn't want to go through the shame." It's a lot of shaming. Being Jewish in an Italian neighborhood, I mean, just a lot of shame from a lot of different directions. Now, obviously, everybody that's shamed is not going to do what he did, but it's really this cocktail. I call it the recipe for violence. These ingredients, when they come together, they make this recipe, and shame and isolation are definitely two of them.
Yeah. And he targeted women. Did you ask him why he targeted women?
I did. I always had the feeling that there was some misogyny behind this. I mean, maybe resentment towards the mom that gave you up for adoption, or,
Right. He was just a few days old, right?
Was that?
He was just a few days old when
she came up. Yeah, actually, he reconciled with her. According to David, they had a beautiful reunion, even though the media made something else of it. And even he spoke ill of it early on. He was mad at her because he felt like she betrayed him by doing interviews with media. But he said, I only said that because I was mad at her. But really, it was a great reunion. He says no. He says that it was not, if females were targeted, probably because of the vulnerable positions of, being in a car and where they were.
Right.
And then also this Druid god that he had made these sacrifices, demanded the blood of virgins in his mind. So if there was any reason for the targeting, it was more that than the misogyny. But I still have my questions. I mean, I still have my question marks about that.
So the killings were rituals then. They were rituals, right? To appease this.
Yeah, I think that, I'm careful in calling it a ritual, because when we call it a ritual, it's sort of this robotic thing where somebody kills just because it's a ritual and nothing to do with their own psychology. It's just they're Satanists and this is what Satan requires, and it's as simple as that. My book doesn't take that approach. I do think that satanic activity was involved from David's own perspective and from my own analysis. I do believe that's a piece of it. But I think that the hook, Satan has no hook. If there's not stuff inside our hearts, like resentment, for instance, is a big one. I think that, I think the rituals, so to speak, were a good outlet for his internal reality, which had been really a buildup from early childhood all the way until adulthood, in a mind that was very distorted and very twisted with how he saw the world. So it's not satanic ritual like just, a bunch of Satanists doing what they're doing because Satan's asking for it. He also had his own internal motivations that were shaped and influenced all through his life and all through his childhood.
So now I grew up in Brooklyn, and I lived pretty close to where his last victim
Stacy
was killed. Stacy, yeah.
God bless her.
And I do remember seeing an interview with her mother, and she said she wrote a letter telling David everything about Stacy. She said, I wanted him to know what he took from me. And it was just, as a mother, it was just so heart-wrenching that she described how she felt carrying her in her womb, and as a baby, like took him through her whole 20 years of life, and then later on ended up forgiving him. Right?
Very true. Nasa was, as you know, a very loud critic and a hater of David Berkowitz.
Yes.
for good reasons.
Yes.
No judgment whatsoever on the woman. She was very loud and clear about the fact that she wanted to see him die, that she wished him nothing but hell. Really hurt. I mean, hurt, that's an understatement. To have her beautiful daughter, tell her on the night she's going out and, meeting a guy on a date, Mom, don't worry, he's not targeting blondes. And on that same night, she's parked in what's Bath, Brooklyn. In what is it? Is it Bath, Brooklyn, or Bath? Name of the town.
Bath. Do you think it? Well, it was Shore Parkway. That I know.
Shore Parkway. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that was considered Bensonhurst.
Yeah, in that Bensonhurst vicinity. Here she is. She's parked, and she's in a car, and she's with a guy, and they had just left the playground. They were in the playground, and David was in the shadows somewhere watching the two of them.
Yeah.
And she gets in the car, and she's seated, and he's seated in the passenger seat, and all of a sudden, 44 caliber bullet.
Yeah.
Window shatters. He screams. She dies hours later. But Nasa was so full of hate. She told her neighbor in Florida, in Miami, and this is recorded somewhere in a Florida newspaper. She said, I got to a point where the hate was so consuming that forgiveness was my way out. I had to forgive. The hate was consuming me.
Yeah.
So she wrote him a letter. Actually, the journalist at the time, Maury Terry, who had written the book The Ultimate Evil and had uncovered cult activity. He had his own theory on the killing. I'll leave it at that. But he had made it happen for David and Nasa. They actually had met, not in person, but by way of camera on some Inside Edition show. And she forgave David. They wrote back and forth. They had a relationship for at least a year. David gave me all the letters, copies, not the original, but I have all the letters. I went through those letters time and time again, and no doubt she forgave him. It was sincere. It was real. They began a friendship. They talked on the phone. They were actually going to meet. A church was paying for her flight from Florida to come to New York to meet with David in person. And she had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And then she passed away in the early 2000s, really broke David up. But I asked David, I said, David, what'd she call you? Because in the media, she called him a dog. She called him a devil, every name you could think of. And he said with tears in his eyes, he said, she called me Davy. And
wow.
Davy was, indicative of sonship, like term of affection, term of endearment. And they had developed a real close bond. You could see it in the letters. Here she is asking David to pray for her other daughter who was sick. So she's asking the guy who killed one daughter to pray for another daughter that's sick. So they really, some letters, there was some anger from Nasa towards him. It wasn't a smooth journey by no means. I don't think anybody that has, and I talk about the journey in the book, it's not the main theme of the book, but it's certainly there. Anybody that knows if you've forgiven somebody that's done something awful, it's hardly ever smooth and easy. It was a very rocky, tumultuous relationship in the beginning, and then eventually there was a mending.
Yeah. Well, that's why it's so important to forgive, because when we forgive, it's really for us. Because that anger, that can really destroy us.
Absolutely.
So and sometimes, and I tell people, if you really can't forgive, ask God to help you.
Absolutely.
Ask the Lord to help you to forgive.
Absolutely.
And He'll soften your heart.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So, okay. I hate to ask this question, but for the viewers, they're probably thinking, well, what about these victims? What about those that lost their lives? What about those that are suffering today? But he has a website. He wrote an apology to them. So he really and sincerely is very regretful and remorseful for what he did.
He is. David, he knows he's never going to right the wrongs, but he can at least make an effort, and that effort will be received by some and maybe bring some type of closure. Closure is probably a strong word, but bring some sense of peace. And then others are not going to receive it, and that's understandable. There's no expectation on his part. He doesn't expect, there's no entitlement to be forgiven by anyone. But he has made the most of the last 35 years of his life. He mentors 16 guys in the prison. He meets with them on Wednesday nights, has a Bible study. He responds to letters from around the world. People write him all the time. The serial killer on the college campus 2 years ago who killed 4 people wrote David a letter.
Did he?
Yes. People reach out to David because they see him as a safe place. How is he going to throw stones at me?
Right.
If he did what he did. So that he, believe it or not, he's a place people go when they've done things that they're ashamed of, when they want to commit suicide because they're so buried in shame and guilt. He's the kind of guy they reach out to. And David has talked suicidal teenagers off the ledge, so to speak. I've seen many of the letters. He gave me full access to his life over the last year and a half. So, my heart breaks for those that have been affected by David. I've been often asked, well, why don't you go help the victims? Well, look, I'm only one man. I sense the responsibility to deal with David. And maybe if you're sensing compassion to the victims, maybe you can do something for the victims. I think we all play a part. Why David for me? Well, I grew up in a home. My dad was in prison. I visited him. I remember my dad was called a monster because he was considered violent by some. And I knew the man. I was in juvenile jail. I was a pastor dealing with inmates. So that's been my trajectory from the very beginning, is to feel compassion towards people that are in prison.
Yeah. And you visited your father when
Yeah.
he was in prison, and your mother said that he was in school.
In school. Yeah, she
Right.
said, well, Italian American families,
Right.
that's the euphemism when dad is
That's
in
exactly.
prison, is he's in college. I said, Mom, what's he in school for? She said, law. So I was 10 years old. I said, wow, this is law school, huh? And to this day, my dad will often say, you know, I went to school. And I'm like, Dad, look, I'm in my mid 40s now. We can get beyond
Right.
you weren't in school.
Right.
Yeah.
So also Michael Francis was there. So tell me how you became friends with him and how he got involved in coming and meeting David.
I met Michael back in 2008. We had actually met in the ministry. He was a speaker at our church on a regular basis. Spent some time with him, one-on-one. In fact, the most recent time I spent with him, I picked him up in Lower Manhattan about maybe a month and a half ago at his hotel. We drove together to upstate New York to the prison to meet with David. Michael and I brought a video camera guy. He met us there, and we videotaped a probably, I don't know, hour and a half interview with David Berkowitz.
Nothing seemed to work out. I went and got an apartment, and it wasn't the best, and I got frustrated there with the neighbors, and I moved again, then I met some other people that said, wanted to find friends. I ran into some bad people that were not, they were just into some occult stuff, and it sounded interesting to me. And so we used to go to Pelham Bay Park once in a while and just hang out and meet there and smoke dope. But this time I was, working, I was trying to make ends meet, and just a lot of life pressures. It was just a very vulnerable time. I was open to things, and
was there one incident that just said, okay, at this point, this is what caused you to start doing those things? I mean,
I think, well, first of all, I don't have my notes with me, but I feel I was really traumatized by demons since I was a child, and I've gotten so much evidence of this over the years. After I became a Christian, I didn't understand it back then, but the Lord opened up my eyes years later to see all of these different events that kind of gelled together to cause this to happen, and I always had a fascination with the darkness.
The interview in its entirety, Michael's going to show it on his YouTube show. Michael wrote the foreword of the book. I felt like he was the perfect person to write the foreword because, number one, he's a New Yorker. David's a New Yorker. Number two, 1970s is a familiar decade for both. Number three, they were both on the other side of the law. And then number four, they both had this Christian conversion. So the parallels were very uncanny. So I brought the two of them together, and they have some conversation, chit chat about common ground in New York City. And then we delve into what was behind Son of Sam and then his life in prison. There was a really well done interview. You'll see it soon on his YouTube channel. I keep bugging him. He's so busy. He's all over the world. When are you going to show the interview? But it'll be soon.
Yeah.
But yeah, I met Michael back in 2008. We've been friends since, and wrote the foreword. You'll enjoy the foreword if you're a New Yorker, because he'll bring to remembrance some of the nostalgia of New York City in the foreword.
Yeah. And he's got an amazing podcast. I know I'm blessed by it.
Yeah.
I watch him every time. I love his interviews.
Definitely.
Yeah. So what stands out the most that you would say, I know that he's for real? Because we hear about, oh yeah, jailhouse conversions, and a lot of people doubt it. And they're just saying that because, they want to pass the parole board, or, but if I were to ask you, what stands out that for sure that he's for real?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a legitimate concern. There are many jailhouse conversions, and I've dealt with prisoners for a long time. Typically, a jailhouse conversion does not last 35 years. Jailhouse conversions typically last about 6 months, and it's usually right before the parole hearing. David Berkowitz became a Christian in 1988, long before parole hearings. In fact, most parole hearings he hasn't even shown up to. He wrote the governor of New York a letter saying, I deserve to stay behind bars forever. It was perceived as arrogance that he didn't show up to the parole hearings, so he decided to go anyway. No expectation of getting out. He's going to be 71 years old. So the idea it's a jailhouse conversion, I mean, 35 years.
Right.
Now, is he perfect? No, he's got
None of us are.
nobody. He's got a lot of hangups. In fact, I confront him about one of his character defects about lying in the book, and we dig into that, and there's a whole chapter on that. But David, at the end of the day, comes clean, and he doesn't always do the right thing, but he often does the right thing after he did the wrong thing, and that's more than most people can say.
Right.
You know, he does eventually come full circle. I got a chance to see, now people think actions is the best litmus test for someone's character. You hear that often. Don't go by speech, go by actions. I agree. Talk is cheap.
Speak louder than words, right?
Actions speak louder than words. I get it, but here's the deal. People can put on a good act. They can. There's something more telling than actions. Now, this is from the perspective of a behavioral scientist. What's more telling than actions is reactions. And that is actions under pressure, actions in real time, actions when a man is caught off guard, when he's taken by surprise, when things don't go his way. I had a chance to see David, not just his actions, but the reactions. I talk about it in the book. One of the sessions I arrive, he has a verbal conflict with an inmate, more one way than two way. The inmate says something degrading. David don't say much, but when I show up, he's fuming. He's angry. He's in bad headspace. I know right away. I know because when he usually walks into the room to meet with me, he's very fatherly to the inmates. Usually stops and makes some personal encounters with other inmates or guards. They call him Pastor Dave. But this time he comes in and he's like quick courtesy smiles, not that intimate. Usually he sits in the chair. He settles into the chair very comfortably. In this case, he sits in the chair, but he's on the edge of the chair. So I'm looking at him and I say, Dave, you're not in a good place right now. And he says, I'm all right. I'm fine. I said, no, you're not right. What's up? What's going on? What's going on in your head? I don't want to talk about it. But I watch this man. I watch him in his anger, and I sit with him for 3.5 hours, and I watch him navigate through that anger like a man that had spent a lot of time in therapy, a lot of time walking with Christ. And he gets angry, but he sins not. He manages the anger. He has anger, but anger doesn't have him. It's human to get angry. I tell you, David Berkowitz gets angry, but he's like, oh, right. He's angry. Well, everybody still gets angry.
Right. Jesus said, don't sin in your anger.
Yeah, this is be angry. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. But sin not. Interesting language there. Be angry. It doesn't say don't get angry.
Right.
Be angry, but sin not. So the anger is tolerable, even as a Christian. How do you manage it? Well, he manages it well. Most people, when they're angry, when they're immature, they externalize. Externalize means if they open their mouth, it's all about what's wrong with people, places, and things. It's all about the system, other people. People need to stop messing with me. He doesn't externalize. He internalizes. He self-reflects. He tells me in great depth what's behind this anger. And I articulate that in the chapter. And by the end of the session, he just breaks down in tears. And he said, what that guy said to me was so humiliating. And really what's behind this is a lot of shame. And we talk about that. So, I got a chance to see, to answer your question, David's reactions. And that's only one example. There are a few others in the book. Reactions are a much better litmus test for someone's character than actions. Now, the culture will say a psychopath cannot change. The data says that psychopaths make very little headway in therapy. Therapists just give up on them. They don't make progress. And I don't doubt that. I've dealt with a lot of psychopaths, but I also believe in miracles. And the thing that marvels me about David's story is, yes, he was a psychopath. Now, some would argue with me and say, no, he wasn't. Yeah, he was. He had low empathy. I won't say no empathy, but low empathy. inability to regulate impulses, lit fires. I mean, he lit up.
Stabbings. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, lit up the psychopathy scoreboard. So he was a psychopath. And now I see empathy. I see the ability to regulate impulse.
Yeah.
I see remorse. I see ownership. Psychopaths will never take ownership of crimes. Never. And I detail that in the book. And to me, those are the reactions of a man. Do I believe he should get out of prison? I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. And neither is David. I think it would be probably a slap in the face to some of the victims and their families if he was released. But I am saying that behind bars in the place he's in, I think he's done a good job of living a productive life.
Yeah. And what the Bible says, you'll know them by their fruit. I mean, he's almost like a modern day Paul. Like, for those that don't know the story, Saul was killing. He was a murderer. He was going around. He was killing Christians. And then he had this conversion, he was redeemed and transformed. So,
And Paul, like David, had many critics that did not believe in his conversion. Biblical scholars believe it's the reason why he has to constantly say, I, the Apostle Paul, because his apostleship was under question. Who is this guy that thinks he's an apostle? If you go back and read the epistles of Paul, you'll see there's language here and there where he's kind of having to advocate for himself as an apostle, because his apostleship, his credibility was under serious suspicion, because he was known as an assassin of those that followed the way being the Christian faith. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting comparison, David and Paul.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just the fact that he wanted to get his story out, and he wants people to know that he is remorseful, that, but he has changed, by the grace of God and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. I remember watching the 700 Club interview when he got saved in 1988. Yes. I remember that. And I was like, so happy to hear that, and I know God can change people, and you don't have to be a murderer, to come to the Lord. I mean, everyone needs the Lord. Everyone needs to have that personal relationship with him.
I think that's the biggest message of the book. Part of the book, a big part of it, is what was behind Son of Sam. Mm-hmm. And any true crime lover is going to, indulge that. But the second part of the book, you'll see it more pronounced in the latter chapters, is a message of hope. Yeah. Is that if a guy this bad, the worst among us, can experience this level of change, then there's hope for the addict who's reading the book. There's hope for anybody in a dark place, psychologically troubled. It's really a message of hope. By the end of it, you'll feel inspired and uplifted.
Yeah. Well, you guys definitely have to get the book. Thank you for sending it to me. I read it. It's wonderful. And thank you for spending that time with him and showing us that he's no longer that monster, that he has changed. He's a changed man. And he's got a ministry now, and God is using him for many people. And, it's possible for anyone that's willing to open up to the Lord. And so now, let me ask you real quick now. Is he Italian American? Like his real father was Italian?
No, the birth name Falco, Falco.
Yeah.
So his mom, his biological mom, who was Jewish, Hungarian Jew, she had an affair. Okay. Now she was already a Falco because she went with a guy named Tony Falco, who owned Falco's Fish Market in Brooklyn. Somebody might remember that's watching this. This goes back to the 40s and 50s. She's got this lover named Tony Falco. Well, he basically runs off on her. Okay. Now she's alone, trying to make ends meet. She actually had a daughter, David's half sister, with this Tony Falco. And she meets this Jewish guy named Joseph Kleinman. He's married. He's already married. He's got a family. And they have a long-standing 20-year affair. And David is born out of that affair. But Joseph Kleinman says to her, because I'm married, that baby, first of all, he didn't want David. Really, he wanted to really figure out a way of getting rid of him, which eventually led to the adoption. But she insisted on having him. She really tried to keep him, but he wouldn't allow it. He threatened to financially starve her because he was becoming her provider, because he already had a wife.
Yeah.
He didn't want to bring shame to his wife. So he said, the baby's going to be named after your last name, which was her previous lover who ran away, Falco. But his birth name would have been Kleinman. He was a Kleinman, really, biological father being Joseph Kleinman, full-blooded mother and father, Hungarian Jew on both sides.
Wow.
Then the Berkowitz, who adopted him, Nat and Pearl, which is very common in Jewish families. Usually you don't adopt outside of your religion back then, outside of your race. So when, Nat...
The fact that they got a Jewish couple, right?
Yeah, they made it clear, the Berkowitz family, to this middle woman named Mrs. Miller. She was sort of the town news body. She knew what was going on. She was responsible for sort of matchmaking. The Berkowitz reached out to her and said, if you know any babies that are up for adoption, in particular Jewish, let me know. And Miss Miller one day called Nat and Pearl and said, next week or whenever in Brooklyn Hospital, there's going to be a baby. He's born from a Jewish family, Hungarian Jew, if you're interested. And they got excited, and they drove from the Bronx all the way to Brooklyn. They met David's birth mother, who was devastated. She did not want to give him up, but she had no money. She was being threatened financially. She handed the baby over on the fourth day to the Berkowitz family right on the stoop of Brooklyn Hospital, and they picked him up. And interestingly enough, they said that when they picked him up from the hospital, they drove him from the stoop of Brooklyn Hospital all the way to the Bronx, and they said that he cried inconsolably the entire drive, no matter what they did. In fact, I think it was Nat's mom that was with them. She was coddling. It might have been Pearl's mom. It was one of David's adopted parents, his mom's. She was coddling him, singing to him. Nothing could console him. He was absolutely inconsolable.
Almost like he knew he was ripped away from his mother. And who knows the stress that she must have been under. I'm sure there was a lot of
major
going on. And
I discussed
baby feels all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I discuss a very interesting theory in behavioral science called prenatal programming. And it's the stuff that happens in the 9 months during our time as a fetus in our mom's womb. We're learning more and more that development does not begin, learning doesn't begin in the classroom. It begins in the womb. An interesting study, fascinating. Babies that were in their mother's womb as a fetus during 9/11, and the moms lived in Lower Manhattan, right when the planes hit the towers, the whole 6 months of hysteria afterwards, those babies are now 20-something years old, and there's a higher rate of PTSD amongst those babies that are now in their 20s. And it speaks of this theory, prenatal development, that what happens in the womb can shape someone's central nervous system in ways that are very difficult to reverse later on in life. And David was a very finicky baby from the very beginning, very hard to console, hard to control. And I believe, not that it's an excuse, but it's one factor.
Right.
What happened with the physical fights between his biological mom, pregnant with him, and Joseph Kleinman. They actually had physical altercations while she was pregnant, played some role in his development.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. I don't know if we mentioned it before, but we were talking about the parents of who's the serial killer, the cannibal. Yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer. Yeah, that his mother was taking medication, and that's probably what caused him, to get on that path. Yeah,
definitely an influence.
Very interesting. Well, it's great what you're doing, and God bless you. This is an amazing ministry because you can help so many people. How can people find you? Reach out to you?
If you want the book, you can go on Barnes and Noble or Amazon. Look for Monster Mirror 100. There is another book, some kids book called Monster Mirror, but you want to look for Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz on mental health and evil phenomenon. Written by Mike Caparelli, PhD. You can order at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. It's also available in Spanish. It's available in Kindle. Audio will probably be later on. Right now, that's not available for audio, but Spanish, Kindle. And if you're interested in me personally speaking at a venue, you can go to Unmuted, which is the name of my nonprofit, UNMUTED. It's named that because it's about giving victims their voices back, unmuting. Unmuted.app, APP. Or look me up on Facebook. I put up teachings on a regular basis on Facebook. I've got a lot of followers there. You can follow me and you'll definitely be enriched.
Nice. And I'll definitely put the links in the description below the video. Can you briefly talk about your other books? I know you have Dr. Jesus.
Yeah, I've got 4 other books. I try to write a book a year. I've written a book called Surviving Feelings. It's a manual for how to deal with dark emotions, handling jealousy, resentment, bitterness, paranoia, mistrust, you name it. I've written a book called The Ox and the Ass. It's about toxic, incompatible relationships. The worst thing a farmer can do is yoke an ox with an ass, because an ox is a hard-working animal, and an ass, well, is sitting on its ass.
Right.
It's a stubborn, lazy animal, and when you yoke those two animals together, much like relationships that are incompatible, you got an ox is trying to go forward. Instead, it's going in circles. It's carrying the dead weight of the ass. That's called The Ox and the Ass. Escaping toxic, incompatible relationships. The other one is Dr. Jesus. It's about mental health subjects from a biblical perspective. And my first book is on recovering from trauma through writing your story. It's called Pen Your Pain into Parables. Yeah. So you can get any one of those books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go on my website, unmuted.app.
Very good. You know, they used to say that opposites attract, and it's better for your partner to be opposite, but now they're saying, no, that's not the case.
Well, if it's opposite in personality, that's good. But if it's opposite in value systems, that's where there's a problem. You know, you're quiet, I'm loud, you're quiet, but we have the same value system. It could be a wonderful match. But if it's, you know, where you value people and I hate people, that's a problem. So it's really making sure you're compatible on a level of values and principles. Personalities being different can actually create a lot of chemistry and be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Sounds good. Learned a lot from you just from this one interview. This was great. I'd like to have you back on again, maybe for your next book. Yeah. That'd be awesome. Also, David Berkowitz has a website. Do you know what the website is?
Yeah, it's not his website per se, but you can find his teachings on it. ariseandshine.org. O-R-G.
Okay. All right. And Mike, I'm just going to ask you if you can close us out in prayer. Maybe
Absolutely.
Pray for anyone that's listening. Maybe they're struggling with depression or
definitely
anything like that. Yes.
Father, I just pray right now for that young man who, Lord, they just feel the pit is too deep. Lord, there's no pit too deep that your love is not deeper. Your arm is not too short. I pray for that young lady who's hates what she sees when she looks in the mirror, the one who's cutting herself, the one who hates her own image, hates her face, hates the sound of her name, uncomfortable in her own body. I pray for those that are just psychologically under oppression, those in dark places. Let the light turn on. I pray this book would light up their dark world. I pray that you, Lord, your presence would just right now lift up their spirits and let them know another day is coming, that weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. This too shall pass. I pray for hope right now, an infusion of hope through this broadcast. Thank you for Denise. Thank you for her ministry and what she does. Expand her reach all through New York City, I pray. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mike, so much. God bless you. Thank you for everything that you're doing. And thank you for showing us that David Berkowitz is no longer a monster, but he's a godly man. Thank you.
Thank you.